In the summer of 1974, every Greek Cypriot knew one thing. If Cyprus was ever in danger, Greece would be there, not as an abstraction, not as a distant motherland with sympathetic feelings and diplomatic statements. There as a guarantee, written into the founding documents of the Republic of Cyprus, signed in London and Zurich in 1960, witnessed by Britain and the United Nations. Greece was a guarantor power. Greece had soldiers stationed on the island. Greece shared the language, the religion, the blood, the 3,000-year history of the people who made up 90% of Cyprus's population. Greece would be there. On July 15, 1974, the tanks came. They did not come from the north. They did not come from Turkey. They came from within. From the Greek Cypriot National Guard, officered entirely by men sent from Athens, commanded by a structure controlled by the Greek military junta, executing an order issued by the most powerful man in Greece at that moment, a man named Dimitrios Ioannidis. The tanks surrounded the presidential palace in Nicosia. The guns opened fire on the building where the elected president of Cyprus was starting his morning. The radio announced that Archbishop Makarios III was dead. He was not dead. 4 days later, Makarios stood before the United Nations Security Council and said something that no Greek Cypriot had ever expected to hear from their own president. He said that Cyprus had been invaded by Greece. This is the story of 1974. Not the simple version. Not the version where there is one villain with one flag. The complete version with all its betrayals, all its failures, all its guilty parties, including the ones whose names are never spoken in the classrooms of the island they helped destroy. To understand July 1974, you have to go back to April 1967. In April 1967, a group of Greek military officers staged a coup in Athens. The democratically elected government of Greece was overthrown. King Constantine II fled into exile. A military junta, the colonels, took power and began ruling Greece as a dictatorship. The junta was brutal, repressive, and consumed by a particular ideology: Enosis, union with Cyprus. The dream that had driven the EOKA struggle of the 1950s and that had never entirely disappeared even after Cyprus achieved independence in 1960. The Republic of Cyprus, established in 1960, was a compromise. Not the Enosis that fighters had died for, but independence, a state in which Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots would govern together under a constitution that protected both communities, guaranteed by Greece, Turkey, and Britain. Archbishop Makarios III became the Republic's first president. He was charismatic, politically brilliant, deeply independent-minded, and a realist. He understood that Enosis, whatever its emotional appeal, was not achievable without triggering a Turkish military response that Cyprus could not survive. He pivoted toward genuine Cypriot independence, a Cyprus that could navigate between the Cold War powers, a Cyprus led by him rather than dictated to by Athens. The junta despised him for it. The colonels in Athens wanted a Cyprus that answered to them. They wanted a Cyprus government that would pursue Enosis on their timeline and their terms. Makarios was doing neither. He was governing Cyprus as an independent president, maintaining relations with the Soviet Union, accepting Communist Party support in domestic politics, and consistently refusing to subordinate Cypriot policy to Athenian diktat. In November 1973, the junta's leadership changed. A particularly hardline officer named Dimitrios Ioannidis, the commander of the Greek military police, a man described by those who dealt with him as fanatical, impulsive, and utterly ruthless, effectively seized control of the regime. The nominal head of state was General Phaedon Gizikis. The real power was Ioannidis. Ioannidis regarded Makarios not merely as inconvenient, but as an enemy of Greece. He believed Makarios was a communist sympathizer. He believed Cyprus was drifting away from Greece and toward Moscow. He believed the only solution was to remove Makarios entirely and install a government that would immediately pursue Enosis. Between 1971 and 1974, 5 separate plans were prepared by the Greek government to overthrow Makarios. 5 plans, documented, archived, historically verified. The Greek military dictatorship spent 3 years plotting to destroy the democratically elected government of a Greek island it claimed to love. The instrument for this destruction was EOKA B. EOKA B was not the same organization as the original EOKA that had fought British colonialism in the 1950s. The original EOKA represented the genuine anti-colonial struggle of a people who wanted self-determination. EOKA B was founded in 1971 by General Grievous after he secretly returned to Cyprus with junta support. But Grievous died in January 1974, 6 months before the coup. After his death, the organization fell under the direct and more radical control of Ioannidis and the Athenian junta. By the summer of 1974, EOKA B was not an independent Cypriot organization. It was a direct tool of the Greek dictatorship. EOKA B planted bombs. It assassinated opponents. It attempted to kill Makarios multiple times. The first assassination attempt in 1971 failed by sheer luck. The organization continued operating with funding, weapons, and political direction from Athens. There is something that Cypriot schools do not teach about EOKA B. Between 1963 and 1974, intercommunal violence on Cyprus had left deep wounds between the Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot communities. Turkish Cypriots had been attacked, displaced from mixed villages, and confined to enclaves. EOKA B and elements of the earlier intercommunal violence bore documented responsibility for atrocities against Turkish Cypriot civilians. These killings were real. They were documented. They contributed to the atmosphere of fear and hostility that Turkey would later use to justify its intervention. Acknowledging this does not justify what Turkey did, but pretending it did not happen produces a version of history that is incomplete. An incomplete history cannot produce understanding or reconciliation. By the spring of 1974, Cypriot intelligence had gathered enough evidence to know exactly what was being planned. In early July, Makarios made a decision that surprised everyone. He wrote an open letter addressed directly to General Gizikis and had it published. The letter was blunt. It named names. It accused the Greek regime of supporting EOKA B, of funding terrorism against the legitimate Cypriot government, of actively working to destroy the Republic of Cyprus. It demanded the immediate withdrawal of Greek officers from the Cypriot National Guard. By writing and publishing this letter, Makarios was essentially saying, "I know what you are planning, and I am saying it publicly so the world knows too." He was right about what they were planning. He underestimated how quickly they would act. July 15th, 1974, 8:20 in the morning. Nicosia. Archbishop Makarios is on the road from his Troodos mountain residence back to the presidential palace. It is a Monday morning. He has spent the weekend at his country home. The road is familiar. The morning is ordinary. Then the radio changes. The broadcasting station has been taken. The voice on the radio is not the normal announcer. The voice announces that the National Guard has launched an operation to remove Makarios from power. Archbishop Makarios is dead. He is in his car. He is alive. He hears his own death announced on the radio of the island he has governed for 14 years. He turns around. He goes to Paphos. At the presidential palace in Nicosia, tanks from the Greek Cypriot National Guard have surrounded the building. The fighting is intense. Two young members of Makarios' presidential guard, Haralambos Kyrilou, aged 19, and Nikos Solomou, aged 21, hold the palace against the armored assault. They buy Makarios the time he needs. He reaches Paphos. British forces from the Akrotiri base retrieve him. A Royal Air Force transport plane carries him to Malta. From Malta, he flies to London. On July 16th, from London, Makarios broadcasts on a makeshift radio signal that reaches Cyprus. Greek Cypriot people. The voice you hear is familiar. You know who is talking to you. I am Makarios. I am the one you elected as your leader. I am not dead. I am alive, and I am with you. In Athens, Ioannidis installs a puppet president. His name is Nikos Sampson, a journalist, a former EOKA fighter, a man with a reputation for brutality against Turkish Cypriots that everyone in Cyprus knew. When Ioannidis was told Sampson would be the new president, he reportedly said with indignation, "There are 500,000 Greeks in Cyprus, and you chose him? He was the one who chose him." The new regime proclaimed the establishment of the Hellenic Republic of Cyprus. Enosis was finally coming. The dream of the junta was about to be realized. It lasted 5 days, because in Ankara, the Turkish government had been watching. And Turkey was also a guarantor power of Cyprus under the 1960 Treaty of Guarantee, a treaty that gave each guarantor power the right to take unilateral military action to restore constitutional order if multilateral action failed. Turkish Prime Minister Bülent Ecevit flew to London. He asked the British to join Turkey in a joint military intervention under the Treaty of Guarantee. Britain refused. Ecevit returned to Ankara. On July 20th, 1974, 5 days after the Greek junta coup, Turkey invaded Cyprus. Turkish paratroopers landed near Kyrenia on the northern coast. Turkish warships appeared in the waters around the island. 2 Cypriot Navy motor torpedo boats, the T-1 and the T-3, were sent out from Kyrenia to engage the Turkish naval flotilla. Both ships were sunk by combined Turkish air and naval attack. The fighting was chaotic and desperate. Greek Cypriot forces launched counterattacks against the Turkish beachhead at Kyrenia, supported by T-34 tanks. The counterattacks failed, and then something happened that captures the full tragedy of 1974 in a single, devastating moment. As part of Operation Niki, Greek military Noratlis transport planes, fixed-wing aircraft sent from Crete, were flying over the island attempting to land reinforcements. Greek Cypriot soldiers on the ground, terrified, exhausted, fighting a war that had begun with Greek tanks attacking their own president 5 days earlier, saw the planes coming and opened fire. They shot down their own side. This was not a military error in the ordinary sense. It was the consequence of everything that had happened in those 5 days. The coup, the confusion, the complete and total destruction of trust between the Greek Cypriot people and the Greek military that had just overthrown their government. When Greek Cypriot soldiers could no longer tell whether Greek planes were coming to help them or coming to kill them, something fundamental had broken beyond repair. In Athens, the full catastrophe was becoming clear. Ioannidis had expected Turkey to make noise and do nothing. Every previous Turkish threat had been bluster. In 1967, Turkey had threatened to invade and been bought off. Ioannidis assumed 1974 would be the same. It was not the same. Ioannidis frantically tried to convince the Greek generals to send military reinforcements to Cyprus. The generals refused. They knew, with the clarity of professional soldiers, that a war with Turkey over Cyprus was unwinnable. The Greek military was not ready. A confrontation with Turkey in 1974 would be a catastrophe for Greece. The junta that had started this catastrophe to achieve Enosis could not follow through on the military consequences of its own decision. On July 23, 1974, 8 days after the coup, the Greek military junta collapsed. It had governed Greece for 7 years. It ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the simple recognition that it had destroyed everything it claimed to protect. Glafkos Clerides became acting president of Cyprus. Samson resigned. The constitutional government of Cyprus was technically restored. Turkey did not leave. On August 14, 1974, 3 weeks after the junta had already fallen, after the coup that gave Turkey its legal justification had been reversed and the democratic government restored, Turkey launched a second invasion, a massive military operation that pushed Turkish forces to control approximately 40% of the island's territory. The Greek junta was gone. The constitutional government was restored. Makarios was alive. By any reasonable interpretation of the Treaty of Guarantee, the justification for Turkish military intervention had ended when the coup ended. Turkey invaded anyway. By the time the fighting stopped, up to 180,000 Greek Cypriots, nearly 1/3 of the entire population, had been forced from their homes in the north. They left behind houses, farms, churches, cemeteries, the accumulated lives of generations. Between 45,000 and 80,000 Turkish Cypriots moved in the other direction, leaving the south for the north. The island was divided along what would become known as the Green Line. It runs through the center of Nicosia. It runs through the center of neighborhoods and roads and lives. It has been there for 50 years. These are the stories that don't fit neatly into anyone's preferred version of history. If you believe the full truth matters more than the comfortable version, subscribe and hit that like button. History deserves better than half the story. The international response to 1974 is a story of failure at every level. Britain was a guarantor power. Britain had military bases on Cyprus, the Akrotiri and Dhekelia sovereign base areas that remain British territory to this day. When Turkey came to London and proposed joint military action under the Treaty of Guarantee, Britain said no. British Foreign Secretary James Callaghan later admitted in his memoirs why. Without American support, Britain could not act, and American support was not coming. Henry Kissinger was the United States Secretary of State in the summer of 1974. The United States was simultaneously consumed by the Watergate scandal. President Nixon would resign on August 9th, weeks after the invasion began. The transition to Gerald Ford's presidency happened simultaneously with the Cyprus crisis. In this political vacuum, Kissinger was running American foreign policy almost entirely alone. Declassified American government documents, now in the public record, reveal what Kissinger said and did. In May 1974, the CIA had reported to Kissinger that Ioannidis was thinking about removing Makarios. The State Department recommended a strong diplomatic warning to Athens. Embassy Athens resisted. The warning was eventually delivered, quietly, at a low level, to a minor functionary of the Greek Foreign Ministry. It produced no effect. After the coup, and after Turkey's first invasion, Kissinger told President Ford, in a meeting documented in declassified minutes, "There is no American reason why the Turks should not have 1/3 of Cyprus." He said, "The Turkish tactics are right. Grab what they want and then negotiate on the basis of possession." This was not private frustration. This was the policy. While international peace talks were underway in Geneva that might have prevented Turkey's second and far more devastating invasion, Kissinger adopted deliberate delaying tactics. The talks broke down. 90 minutes after the Geneva talks collapsed, Turkey launched its second invasion. Britain had proposed sending a naval task force between Cyprus and the Turkish invasion fleet, a physical interposition that might have stopped or limited the second invasion. According to multiple sources, including British officials who were present, Kissinger vetoed the idea. Britain did not send the fleet. Kissinger denied this. He denied most of it. He spent the rest of his long life arguing that he had done what was possible given the constraints of the moment. But the United States was the only power that could have applied sufficient pressure on Turkey to stop the second invasion. Turkey was, and remains, heavily dependent on American military hardware and American political support within NATO. Kissinger chose not to apply that pressure. When students in Heraklion, Crete, demonstrated after the invasion, their slogans were simple: Kissinger, murderer. Americans get out. Kissinger himself admitted he never felt comfortable about how he handled Cyprus. A journalist who interviewed him in his later years noted that his facial expression changed markedly whenever Cyprus was mentioned. History, he once acknowledged, would not treat him lightly on this subject. He was correct. The United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 353 on July 20th, unanimously demanding the immediate withdrawal of all foreign military personnel from Cyprus. Turkey ignored it. The UN passed more resolutions. Turkey ignored those too. It has ignored them for 50 years. The 40,000 Turkish troops that arrived in 1974 remain in northern Cyprus today. The territory they control, approximately 37% of the island, has been declared the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, recognized by no country in the world except Turkey. The missing persons of 1974, Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots who disappeared during the fighting, number approximately 1,510. Their families spent decades not knowing whether their loved ones were alive or dead. DNA identification work has continued for years. Some families have finally had answers. Many have not. Makarios returned to Cyprus in December 1974. Approximately half the island's population came out to welcome him back to Nicosia. He resumed the presidency of the truncated republic, the southern portion of the island that remained under Greek Cypriot control. He died in office in August 1977. He never saw the north again. He died governing half of an island from which the other half had been taken by the chain of events that began with a coup staged in his own capital by forces controlled from Athens. The junta leaders were tried in Greece after democracy was restored. Ioannidis was convicted and imprisoned. He died in prison in 2010. He never publicly expressed remorse for what his decisions had produced. Nikos Sampson, the puppet president installed for 5 days, was eventually released on medical grounds in 2000. He died in 2001. In interviews in his final years, he showed little remorse. The Greek officers who commanded the National Guard on July 15, 1974, the men who fired on the presidential palace, most of them returned to Greece. Most faced limited consequences. In Cyprus, the story of 1974, taught in schools, focuses overwhelmingly on the Turkish invasion and occupation. This is understandable. The Turkish invasion caused the displacement of nearly 180,000 people. The Turkish occupation divides the island to this day. These are real crimes with real victims that continue into the present. But the full story, the story of how that invasion became possible, of what created the conditions for it, of who bears responsibility for the coup that gave Turkey its legal pretext, this part is harder to teach. It requires acknowledging that Greeks did this to Cyprus, that Greek officers, following orders from a Greek dictatorship, attacking a Greek Cypriot president, created the crisis that Turkey then exploited with devastating consequences. This is not a defense of Turkey. Turkey's second invasion, launched after the junta had already fallen, after the constitutional government had been restored, had no legitimate justification. The occupation that followed, the displacement of nearly 180,000 Greek Cypriots, the decades of refusing UN resolutions, none of this was justified by what Greece did in July 1974. But the coup happened, and without the coup, there would have been no invasion. Every Greek Cypriot family that lost a home in the north in 1974 lost it because Turkey invaded, and Turkey invaded because Greece staged a coup, and Greece staged a coup because a military dictatorship in Athens decided that the elected president of an independent island did not have the right to govern his own country. Three parties bear responsibility for what happened to Cyprus in 1974. Not one, not two. Three, the Greek military junta that staged the coup. Turkey, which used the coup as justification for an invasion it had long wanted, and which continued that invasion long after any justification had expired. The United States, which had advanced knowledge of what was coming, which chose not to stop it, and which then failed to apply the pressure that might have prevented the second and most devastating invasion. Cyprus was betrayed twice in 1974, once by Greece, once by Turkey, and the power that might have stopped both betrayals chose to do almost nothing. The green line is still there. The missing are still being identified. The displaced families are now in their second and third generation. People who have never seen the villages their grandparents fled, who carry the grief of a loss they did not personally experience, but that has shaped everything about who they are. The full truth of 1974 is not comfortable for anyone to hear, not for Greeks, not for Turks, not for Americans, not for the British who had legal obligations they chose not to fulfill. But 50 years later, the families of the missing and the displaced deserve more than comfortable versions of history. They deserve the truth, all of it. If this video told you something you had never heard before, that like button matters. It helps this reach someone else who needs to hear it. This channel exists to tell the stories that don't fit neatly into anyone's preferred version of history. If that matters to you, subscribe. Where are you watching from? If your family was directly affected by 1974, if you have family in the north, if you are a refugee or a child of refugees, tell us in the comments. These stories belong to the people who lived them. Thank you for watching. The truth about Cyprus deserves to be told fully, honestly, and without flinching. That is what we try to do today.